3 years. 1,095 days. That's exactly how long it took for me to stop looking at my phone every 5 minutes, hoping for a name that never appeared. Julian didn't just leave, he evaporated. No fight, no explanation, no final goodbye. He left me in a vacuum of silence that felt heavier than any scream. People tell you that time heals all wounds, but they lie. Some silences just grow deeper, turning into a hollow ache in your chest that becomes a part of who you are. For 3 years, I carried the weight of a single, unanswered question: why? It was a Tuesday morning, just like any other, until my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I expected a work email or a spam alert, but when I saw the screen, my heart skipped a beat, then seemed to stop altogether. It was a text from an unknown number, but the words were unmistakable. "I'm at our old coffee shop. Please, just once, come see me." I didn't need a name to know who it was. That specific coffee shop, that tone of quiet desperation, it was him. After 3 years of ghosts, Julian had finally decided to speak. The Blue Velvet Cafe was more than just a place to grab a latte, it was the epicenter of our universe. It was where we shared our first laugh, our first dream, and our first secret. Stepping back into that neighborhood felt like walking through a minefield of memories. Every street corner, every familiar scent of roasted beans and old books, felt like it was mocking me. That cafe was where I had buried my peace of mind, and now, it was calling me back to face the ghost I had tried so hard to forget. I stood in front of my closet for an hour, my hands shaking as I reached for a specific hanger. It was the navy blue silk dress. Julian used to say it made my eyes look like the ocean at midnight. I didn't wear it because I wanted to look pretty for him. I wore it as armor. I wanted him to see that the girl he walked away from was still here, still strong, yet haunted by his absence. Putting it on felt like a ritual, a preparation for a battle I wasn't sure I was ready to fight. The walk to the cafe felt like an eternity. The cool autumn air hit my face, but I was burning up from the inside. My mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, to keep my dignity intact. Another part of me wanted to scream at him in front of everyone, to demand back the years of sleep I'd lost. Every step I took toward that door felt like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff, not knowing if I was about to fly or fall. As I approached the entrance, the memory of that final night hit me like a physical blow. We had dinner, we talked about the future, he held my hand across the table, and then, nothing. The next morning, his phone was disconnected. His apartment was empty. It was as if he had been erased from reality. For 3 years, I had blamed myself. I had replayed every conversation, searching for a sign I had missed, a mistake I had made. The mystery of his disappearance had been my personal prison. Through the condensation on the large glass window, I saw him. He was sitting in the same corner booth we used to call ours. His hair was a bit longer, messier, and he wore that old, worn-out leather jacket that smelled like cedar and rain. He looked the same, yet fundamentally different. He was staring out the window, but his gaze didn't seem to land on anything. There was a stillness about him that was unsettling, a quietness that felt louder than the chatter of the crowded cafe. I pushed the door open, and the familiar chime of the bell echoed through the room. It was the same sound that used to signal the start of our dates, but now it sounded like a funeral knell. The cafe was alive with the sounds of clinking porcelain and hushed whispers, but for me, the world had gone silent. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the trembling in my hands. This was it. There was no turning back now. The answers were only a few feet away. When the bell rang, several people looked up, but Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. He just sat there, frozen, his profile etched against the morning light. I noticed his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden table, a nervous habit he never used to have. It was as if he was listening for something, waiting for a signal that only he could hear. The distance between us felt like a vast ocean, even though I was only seconds away from his table. I reached the table and stood directly in his line of sight, my shadow falling across his hands. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and whispered his name. Julian. My voice was thick with all the anger, sorrow, and longing I had suppressed for 1,000 days. He slowly turned his head toward me, but as his eyes met mine, my breath caught. They were vacant. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me, into a void I couldn't see. I reached the table and stood directly in his line of sight, my shadow falling across his hands. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and whispered his name. Julian. My voice was thick with all the anger, sorrow, and longing I had suppressed for 1,000 days. He slowly turned his head toward me, but as his eyes met mine, my breath caught. They were vacant. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me, into a void I couldn't see. I waited for him to jump up, to apologize, to hug me, or even to look guilty. But he did none of those things. His eyes were wide, beautiful as ever, but they were static. There was no recognition, no spark of the man who used to read my thoughts just by looking at me. It was like looking at a masterpiece that had been drained of its color. I waved a hand slightly, a desperate, childish test, but his pupils didn't track the movement. The realization hit me like cold water, he wasn't ignoring me. He couldn't see me. Julian. I repeated, my voice cracking this time. Why did you call me here after all this time? Why now? I wanted to sound furious, but I just sounded broken. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple moving as he tried to find his voice. He reached out into the air, his hand trembling, searching for something to anchor himself. He looked so fragile, so unlike the confident man who had walked out of my life without a word. The anger I had carefully cultivated for 3 years began to leak out of me, replaced by a terrifying dread. His hand finally found the edge of the table, his fingers gripping the wood until his knuckles turned white. He reached for a glass of water, but his fingers brushed against the side, nearly knocking it over. I instinctively reached out to steady it, my fingers accidentally brushing against his. He flinched as if he'd been burned. That small, accidental contact sent a jolt through my entire body. It was the first time I had felt his skin in 3 years, and it felt like home and heartbreak all at once. Sienna, he whispered. It wasn't a question, it was a prayer. He didn't turn his head toward my voice, he tilted his ear, as if he was trying to visualize me through the sound alone. Is that really you? The way he said my name with such reverence and pain shattered the last of my defenses. I stood there, paralyzed, watching him try to navigate the few inches of space between us. He was blind. My Julian, the artist, the man who lived for the colors of the sunset, was trapped in total darkness. Yes, it's me, I managed to say, the tears finally spilling over. I sat down across from him, my knees feeling like they would give way. He let out a long, shuddering breath. You're wearing the blue dress, he said softly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I can smell the perfume you only wear with that dress. Vanilla and sandalwood. How could he know? How could he remember the smallest details when he had thrown the big ones away? The world around us faded into a blur. It was just the two of us, trapped in a booth and a tragedy. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Sienna, he began, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. I left because I loved you too much to let you watch me disappear. He explained that 3 years ago, he started seeing flashes, then shadows. The doctors called it a rare, aggressive degenerative condition. There was no surgery, no cure. Within months, his world would turn to black. He told me he couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden, of turning the woman he adored into a full-time caretaker. He described the weeks leading up to his disappearance, the secret doctor appointments, the terrifying mornings when he woke up and couldn't see the clock. He had kept it all from me because he wanted our last memories to be perfect. He wanted me to remember him as the man who looked at me with adoration, not the man who would eventually need me to lead him by the hand. He had made a choice for both of us, a choice he thought was noble, but one that had left me drowning in a sea of why. I thought I was being a hero, he said, a bitter laugh escaping him. I thought if I just vanished, you'd eventually find someone else. Someone who could give you a normal life, someone who could see the beauty I could no longer describe. He had moved to a different city, learned Braille, and struggled through the terrifying transition into a world of sound and touch alone. He had lived in a self-imposed exile, punishing himself so that I wouldn't have to suffer alongside him. He had spent 3 years in the dark, in more ways than one. I listened as he spoke about the nights he spent staring at where the walls used to be, imagining my face. He told me that the hardest part wasn't losing his sight, it was the fear that I would move on and forget him, even though that was exactly what he had intended. Every time I heard a voice that sounded like yours, I'd stop breathing, he confessed. He had lived a double life, trying to push me away while secretly holding on to every memory of us like a lifeline. He was a martyr for a cause I never asked for. I wanted you to be free, Sienna. Truly free, he whispered, his eyes searching the empty space in front of him. But as he said those words, I realized he had never understood. Freedom wasn't being without him. Freedom was choosing him, no matter the cost. By leaving, he hadn't freed me. He had imprisoned me in a cycle of grief that had no closure. He thought he was saving me from a hard life, but he had handed me a broken one instead. I reached across the table and took his hand, this time holding it firmly. As I held his hand, I felt the rough texture of his palms. Hands that used to paint masterpieces were now covered in small scars from learning to navigate a sightless world. The fire of my anger, which had kept me warm for 3 years, finally went out, leaving behind nothing but cold, raw empathy. I realized that while I was mourning a ghost, he was living a nightmare. We had both been victims of his pride and his misplaced love. There was no point in being angry at a man who had already lost everything. I stood up and moved to his side of the booth, sliding in next to him. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. I took his hand and placed it on my cheek. I'm right here, Julian. I'm not a memory. I'm real. His fingers were hesitant at first, then they began to move, tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my lips, the bridge of my nose. He was seeing me for the first time in years. His touch was light, as if he was afraid I would crumble if he pressed too hard. You've changed, he whispered. You feel older, stronger. I had to be strong because you weren't there to catch me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. We sat there in that crowded cafe, 2 souls reuniting in the midst of a tragedy. He told me about the loneliness, the kind that echoes in an empty apartment, the kind that makes you talk to yourself just to hear a human voice. I told him about my loneliness, the kind that makes you feel invisible in a room full of people because the only person who truly saw you is gone. We were two broken halves finally clicking back together. We didn't care about the people staring at us. We didn't care about the cold coffee sitting on the table. For the first time in 3 years, we were honest. We let the tears fall, tears for the lost time, tears for the missed birthdays and anniversaries, tears for the man who thought he was a hero and the woman who just wanted her partner. The Blue Velvet Cafe had seen many stories, but none as heartbreakingly beautiful as this. We were mourning the past, but for the first time, we were doing it together. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the floor, we just talked. I described the world outside to him, the color of the falling leaves, the way the light was hitting the glass buildings across the street. He told me how his other senses had sharpened, how he could hear the smile in my voice, how he could feel the slight tremble in my hand. We were relearning each other, not through eyes and art, but through words and presence. It was a different kind of intimacy, deeper and more fragile than before. "Why did you reach out now?" I asked. He hesitated, his grip on my hand tightening. "Because I realized that living without you in the dark was worse than anything I was trying to protect you from. I'm selfish, Sienna. I couldn't die without knowing if you hated me." The honesty of his admission was a heavy weight. We were standing on the threshold of a second chance, but it wasn't the fairy tale I had imagined. It was complicated, difficult, and full of uncertainty. But as I looked at him, I knew I couldn't walk away again. Forgiveness is a strange thing. It doesn't mean the pain goes away, it just means you decide the person is worth the pain. I looked at Julian, this man who had broken my heart to save his own pride, and I chose to forgive him. Not because what he did was right, but because life was too short to spend it apart. He had made a mistake fueled by love, and I had spent 3 years fueled by his absence. It was time to stop the cycle. "I forgive you," I whispered. "But don't you ever leave me in the dark again." He pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine. In that silence, a silent vow was made. No more secrets, no more noble sacrifices. If the world was going to be dark, we would navigate it together. I would be his eyes, and he would be my heart. It was a terrifying promise to make, a commitment to a life that would be harder than anything I had ever known. But as I breathed in the familiar scent of him, I knew there was nowhere else I'd rather be. The ghost had returned, and this time, he was staying. The cafe was closing. We stood up, and for the first time, I saw how he functioned. He took out a collapsible white cane, his movements practiced and efficient. It was a stark reminder of his new reality. I stepped to his side and offered my arm. He tucked his hand into the crook of my elbow, a gesture that felt both new and ancient. We walked out of the Blue Velvet Cafe together, the chime of the bell signaling not an end, but a beginning. The cool evening air greeted us, fresh and full of possibility. The city lights were beginning to twinkle, reflecting off the damp pavement. To me, it was a beautiful NYC evening. To Julian, it was a series of sounds, the honking of taxis, the chatter of commuters, the rustle of wind through the trees. I began to narrate our walk, describing the neon signs and the faces of the people passing by. I was his window to a world he could no longer see, and he was my anchor to a reality that finally made sense. We were walking blindly, not into darkness, but into a new kind of light. As we walked, we talked about the things we had missed. My promotion, his sister's wedding, the small moments that make up a life. There was a lingering sadness for the 3 years we could never get back, the 1,000 days of silence that could have been filled with laughter. We couldn't erase the past, and we couldn't fix the damage Julian's departure had caused. But we could choose what to do with the time we had left. The weight was still there, but we were carrying it together now, and that made it feel lighter. Julian stopped at a corner, listening to the sound of a street musician playing a violin. "I used to think beauty was something you saw," he said, a soft smile on his face. "But now I realize beauty is something you feel. It's the warmth of your arm against mine. It's the way your voice changes when you're happy. It's the fact that you're still here." I realized then that our love had evolved. It was no longer based on the superficial or the visual. It was built on something much more resilient. It was a love that didn't need eyes to see the truth. There is a profound healing that happens when you are finally where you belong. All the therapy, all the distractions, and all the moving on I had tried over the last 3 years hadn't done a fraction of what this one afternoon had accomplished. Just being in his presence, hearing his breath, and feeling his touch was closing the wounds I thought would be open forever. We weren't fixed, and our situation wasn't perfect, but for the first time in 1,000 days, I felt whole. The power of just being there together was enough. We reached my apartment building. I looked at Julian, standing there in the soft glow of the street lamp. "I don't want to go back to my hotel," he said, his voice vulnerable. "I don't want to be alone in the dark anymore." I squeezed his hand. "You don't have to be." We walked up the stairs, leaving the ghosts of our past on the sidewalk. Our new life was starting, a life of challenges, of learning, of patience. It wouldn't be easy, but as we entered the apartment, the darkness didn't feel scary anymore. It felt like home. This wasn't the end of a story, it was the prologue of a new one. Life doesn't always give you a perfect ending, and it rarely gives you a second chance. But when it does, you grab it with both hands and never let go. Julian and I have a long road ahead of us, full of shadows we will have to navigate. But as I watched him find his way to the sofa, guided by the sound of my voice, I knew one thing for certain: the most important things in life aren't seen with the eyes. They are felt with the heart. And our story, our real story, was just beginning.